You're not really family, so you shouldn't come," my sister Harper said that morning, her voice tight and unwavering as she folded the Easter invitations on the kitchen table. I froze, holding the envelope for our family brunch, feeling a strange mix of shock and disbelief. The words echoed in my mind, clashing with decades of shared memories, birthdays, and holidays. Could she really be saying that Easter, our sacred family tradition, was only for those she deemed real family? The sting was immediate, but beneath it was an unsettling suspicion I had long buried. Something in our family history might not be what I had always believed. That suspicion would grow, escalating quietly at first, until a surprising twist, one I could never have anticipated, would change everything and force us to confront the truth hidden in plain sight. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Jenna Whitmore, and I had spent my entire life believing that my family was straightforward, simple, and unbroken. We were an average American family in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Mom, Dad, my sister Harper, and me. Our lives revolved around school schedules, weekend softball games, and the usual family holidays. But Easter was always special. Every spring, our house transformed. Pastel-colored tablecloths, handmade baskets overflowing with chocolates, lilies and daffodils on the windowsills, and a long-standing tradition of a family brunch that stretched late into the afternoon. Invitations were sent weeks in advance with careful notes about dress codes, seating arrangements, and dietary needs. It was, in many ways, a celebration of continuity and togetherness. Or, at least, that's what I had believed until Harper's words pierced through the illusion of certainty. That morning began like any other Easter weekend. The air smelled faintly of blooming tulips from the garden outside, and the kitchen smelled of fresh-baked pastries and coffee. Mom was bustling about, humming a tune I didn't recognize, while Dad was quietly sipping his espresso, scanning the newspaper. Harper entered the room sharply, her brow furrowed, holding the invitations in a rigid grip. "Jenna, sit down," she demanded. My stomach sank. The tone wasn't playful, wasn't teasing, it was authoritative, like she held some indisputable truth. I lowered myself onto the edge of the counter, confusion gnawing at me. "What's going on?" I asked cautiously, though I already sensed the answer wouldn't be easy to swallow. Harper took a deep breath, and then she said it again, more firmly. "Easter is for real family only. Well, you don't qualify. I'm serious." I felt my heart lurch. My hand shook slightly as I gripped the counter, my mind racing. This was the first time in years that a family holiday had felt like a battlefield. I could hear the quiet hum of the coffee machine and Mom's tentative steps approaching, but I wasn't ready to hear any explanations. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Harper's eyes were sharp, unyielding. "You know. There are things you don't know, and it's time someone said it. You shouldn't come to Easter." I felt a sudden chill, like someone had turned the temperature in the room down 10 degrees. Memories of past holidays flashed before my eyes, the laughter, the shared jokes, the way our family seemed inseparable. And yet, buried beneath those memories were moments of subtle exclusion, half-heard whispers and questions I had asked that were always met with vague answers. Could Harper be serious? Could she be holding something from me all these years? I realized in that instant that this wasn't just a quarrel over seating or table arrangements. It was a confrontation with a long-suppressed family secret, something buried so deep that no one had spoken of it openly. Mom stepped closer then, her hands lifted as if to soothe the rising tension. "Harper, maybe we should explain," she started, but Harper cut her off. "No, Mom, I'm telling her. She deserves to know where she really stands." My mind spun. "What?" I asked, trying to maintain composure, though my chest felt tight. Harper hesitated, biting her lip, her hands trembling slightly as she rearranged the invitations in a meticulous stack. The house, usually filled with warmth and chatter on Easter morning, was now heavy with a sense of suspense and fear. The quiet was almost unbearable. That's when it hit me. Harper wasn't just being cruel or whimsical. She was revealing a hidden fault line in the family, a fracture that had been covered up for years. A part of me wanted to walk out the door and escape the uncertainty, to leave the invitations on the counter and pretend none of this had been said. But another part, the part that had always been curious, cautious, and unafraid of facing difficult truths, knew that I couldn't. I needed to know what she meant, why Easter suddenly felt like a line drawn in the sand, and whether my place in the family was truly as secure as I had believed.
And so I sat there, frozen but determined, as Harper finally began to explain. A story that stretched back decades, tangled with family tensions, old rivalries, and a long hidden truth that would ultimately lead to DNA testing, unexpected revelations, and a confrontation that none of us could have anticipated. That morning, the seemingly innocent tradition of Easter became the catalyst for uncovering a secret that would challenge my identity, test my courage, and ultimately change our family forever. The rest of the morning passed in a haze of tension that I could barely process. I wandered through our living room, trying to make sense of Harper's words, the echoes of her claim replaying in my mind with every step I took across the worn oak floorboards. Mom and Dad moved around quietly, careful to avoid adding fuel to the fire, but their presence only reminded me of how much had gone unspoken in our family. I realized then that the problem wasn't just Harper's declaration about Easter. It was a symptom of a deeper, long-standing pattern of secrecy, favoritism, and unaddressed tensions. Growing up, Harper had always been the golden child, the one who followed Mom's lead flawlessly, while I was often overlooked, my accomplishments quietly praised but rarely celebrated. I had assumed this was normal sibling rivalry, a typical dynamic, but Harper's words revealed that there was something far more complicated simmering beneath the surface, a hidden problem I had ignored for far too long. I tried to piece together my memories, replaying moments that had felt odd or uncomfortable over the years. Invitations to family events that had arrived late or not at all. Subtle comments about blood relatives or real family that Mom or Dad had made offhandedly. Whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when I entered the room. For years, I had brushed these off as nothing more than miscommunication or imagination. But Harper's declaration made me question everything. If she could openly say that I wasn't real family, then perhaps the subtle patterns I had noticed were clues, breadcrumbs pointing toward a truth I had been unwilling to confront. The realization left a knot of anxiety in my stomach, but also a strange, curious determination. I needed to understand the reality of my family, no matter how uncomfortable it might be. I moved into the kitchen where the aroma of coffee and freshly baked cinnamon rolls usually brought comfort, but today it felt like a backdrop to a courtroom trial. Mom was quietly arranging the table, glancing at me nervously, while Dad read the newspaper but kept shooting me concerned looks. Harper, perched on the edge of the counter, tapped her foot impatiently, her expression a mixture of triumph and unease. It was clear that she felt powerful in this moment, having seized control of a secret that I had been oblivious to, but I was also aware of the fragility beneath her bravado. Secrets like this were never simple, and the more I observed her, the more I realized that our family's hidden problems were layered with emotion, fear, and years of unspoken expectations. I decided to confront Mom first, hoping she could provide some clarity. Mom, what does Harper mean by real family only? Is there something I don't know? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though my pulse had quickened. She froze for a moment, glancing at Dad before sighing heavily. Jenna, it's complicated, she admitted, her eyes darting toward Harper, who was now leaning back with an almost imperceptible smirk. There are things in our family history that, well, some people never talk about. I thought you were too young to worry about it, but Harper has a way of forcing these conversations. I frowned, frustration rising. Mom, I'm not a child anymore. I deserve to know. Why now? Why this morning? She hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she wiped a stray crumb from the counter. Because you need to understand the truth, Jenna. It's about who belongs and who doesn't. There's been confusion, and Harper, well,
She's been trying to protect the rest of us from the mess, but she can be blunt.
Preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Her words did little to calm me. The term mess felt ominous, suggesting layers of family secrets that I had not even begun to imagine. It was clear that the Easter brunch issue was a symptom, a public manifestation of something far deeper, a hidden tension that had silently shaped our family dynamics for years. I thought about Harper's tone, her insistence, the absolute certainty in her voice. This wasn't just sibling rivalry, it was a power play rooted in knowledge that I lacked. Knowledge that gave her a sense of authority I hadn't realized she possessed. The feeling of being an outsider in my own family struck me sharply. The hidden problem wasn't just Harper. It was the unspoken rules, the selective truths, and the way certain members were allowed privileges based on information that was deliberately withheld.
Over the next few hours, I began quietly gathering details, asking subtle questions and paying close attention to the patterns in our family interactions. Harper remained sharp and guarded, but I noticed small slips. Phrases she used, glances exchanged with Mom, the way Dad's tone changed ever so slightly when certain topics arose. Each observation added to the growing realization that my family's version of truth was incomplete, carefully curated to maintain appearances and protect certain members from reality. I felt a mix of emotions: anger at the years of exclusion, curiosity about the truth, and a growing determination to uncover what had been hidden. By mid-afternoon, I had pieced together a partial picture of the dynamics. Harper's insistence on real family reflected favoritism, reinforced by long-held family secrets. Mom's guarded behavior revealed attempts to shield me, and Dad's quiet observation suggested unspoken concerns he was unwilling to voice. The more I uncovered, the clearer it became that the Easter brunch confrontation was not the root issue. It was the catalyst, the spark that forced long-suppressed tensions and secrets into the open. I realized that I could no longer ignore the patterns or pretend everything was normal. The hidden problem had reached a tipping point, and I needed to act carefully, thoughtfully, and decisively to understand the full story and assert my rightful place in the family before any further damage was done. As the sun began to dip in the sky, casting a warm glow across the living room, I sat down with a notebook and began documenting everything I had observed, every memory that now seemed to carry a different meaning, and every question that demanded answers. I knew this was only the beginning, the groundwork for uncovering a truth that would shake the foundation of our family and change the way we related to each other forever. The hidden problem, I realized, was not just Harper's words or behavior. It was the legacy of secrecy, selective truths, and unspoken rules that had governed our lives for far too long, and I was determined to get to the bottom of it. That evening, the tension in the house thickened, almost tangible, like the air had been compressed under the weight of unspoken truths. I tried to focus on small tasks, folding laundry, organizing the pantry, but every creak of the floorboards and every distant laugh from Harper felt loaded with meaning, reminding me that the day's confrontation had only opened the door to a much larger revelation. I realized that the situation could no longer be ignored. The old rhythm of family life, with its subtle exclusions and whispered half-truths, had been broken. Something had shifted irreversibly, and I knew that the breaking point, the moment where we could no longer maintain appearances or suppress uncomfortable truths, was approaching. I had to find clarity, and I had to do it before the Easter holiday ended in resentment and fracture. The first real clue came when Dad, who had been uncharacteristically quiet all day, finally spoke up. He had been seated in his armchair, the dim lamp casting a soft glow over his face, but his voice carried an unfamiliar gravity. "Jenna, I think it's time we talk about your place in the family," he said, his gaze steady. My heart skipped a beat. For years, Dad had been the mediator,
the one who smoothed over tensions between Harper and me, rarely taking sides openly. The fact that he was addressing this now signaled that the situation had reached a point where avoidance was impossible. I sat down across from him, hands clasped tightly, and waited, bracing myself for whatever he might reveal. Dad took a deep breath, then began recounting family history in a way I had never heard before. There are things about our family you've never known. Some connections, some decisions. They weren't always what they seemed. Easter, holidays, even some of the traditions you've grown up with were often shaped by choices made before you were born. Choices meant to protect, but also to hide certain realities. My stomach tightened. I had suspected for a while that there were layers to our family dynamics, but hearing it spoken aloud with intentionality and a serious tone made the implications sink in immediately. The room felt smaller, and the familiar furniture seemed to press in around me as I tried to digest what Dad was saying. I pressed him for specifics. Dad, I need to understand. Are you saying there's a secret? Something I've been excluded from? He nodded slowly, his expression heavy. Yes, it's complicated. It involves bloodlines, inheritance, and decisions made decades ago. Harper has always been aware, which is why she sometimes acts differently. She protects what she knows, but she can also be sharp when it comes to boundaries. Today's Easter incident, it wasn't just about brunch. It was a culmination of years of unspoken tensions and selective truth. The words hit me harder than I expected. Selective truth. The idea that my understanding of my family, my identity, and my place in this household could have been curated, controlled, or even falsified was both terrifying and electrifying. I felt an immediate need to confront Harper, to get her side directly. I found her in her room, seated on the bed, her phone in hand, but her attention fully on me as I entered. "Harper, I need answers," I said, my voice low but firm. She didn't flinch. Instead, she looked up, eyes calculating, as if weighing how much of the story she could reveal. "Jenna," she said slowly, "you're finally starting to see. I've tried to protect you, in a way. There are things about this family that, well, the truth can be complicated. Not everyone handles it well." My pulse quickened. "Protect me? Harper, all I know is that today you excluded me. You made it clear I don't belong. I deserve to know why." She sighed, placing the phone down and leaning back against her headboard. "You do, and maybe you'll be glad you waited because the truth, it's bigger than you imagine. Some of it involves DNA, some involves old family choices that were never meant to be questioned. Today was the breaking point, Jenna. You're old enough, and it's time." Her words were both a warning and a challenge. I realized in that instant that the situation had escalated beyond simple sibling conflict. This was no longer about invitations or holiday seating arrangements. It was about identity, lineage, and a hidden truth that had quietly shaped our family for decades. I felt a mixture of fear, curiosity, and a strange exhilaration. The breaking point had arrived, the moment where the old way, pretending everything was normal, ignoring patterns of favoritism, and suppressing questions, was no longer viable. Something had to give. That night, I lay in my room, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the implications. DNA testing, bloodlines, secrets. For the first time, I realized that Harper's sharp declaration at breakfast was not an act of cruelty alone, but a reflection of the family's fear of exposure, a desperate attempt to maintain control over what had always been carefully hidden. My mind raced with possibilities. What if the results contradicted what I had always been told? What if my identity, the very foundation of my belonging in this family, was called into question? And yet, beneath the anxiety was a thrill, a realization that the truth, however uncomfortable, would finally be revealed. By morning, I had made a decision. I would pursue clarity, I would seek answers, and I would confront the family's hidden truths with evidence and resolve. The breaking point had passed, and the story of my identity and place in this family was about to shift dramatically. Easter, once a simple celebration of togetherness, had become the catalyst for revelation, forcing each of us to confront what we had avoided for decades. The stage was set for a confrontation, a journey of discovery, and a series of revelations that would change everything we thought we knew about ourselves and each other. The next morning, I felt a sense of determination unlike anything I had experienced before. After the previous day's revelations and Harper's cryptic warnings, I knew that I couldn't navigate this alone. I needed someone impartial, someone who could help me uncover the truth without bias or favoritism. That's when I decided to reach out to my cousin Claire, a cousin I hadn't spoken to in years, but who had always been level-headed, and who I suspected might know pieces of the family history that had been hidden from me. Claire answered on the second ring, her voice light and cheerful, but I could hear curiosity underlining her questions as I explained the situation briefly. "Jenna," she said carefully, "I've always suspected there were family stories you weren't told. Maybe it's time we figure this out together." Her willingness to engage, to act as an outside observer, gave me a glimmer of hope. I wasn't entirely alone in this, and perhaps an external perspective could shed light on the inconsistencies I'd long sensed but never fully understood. By midday, Claire arrived at our house, her her presence calm and reassuring. She immediately sensed the tension, the taut atmosphere that hung like a storm cloud over the living room. "You've got a lot to explain," she said gently, sitting on the sofa and crossing her legs. I took a deep breath and began recounting the events of the morning, starting with Harper's declaration, moving through the vague hints Dad had given me the night before, and ending with my own observations of patterns and omissions in our family interactions. Claire listened carefully, occasionally nodding, occasionally scribbling notes on a small pad she carried in her purse. I realized as I spoke that even with my detailed recollection, the story felt incomplete, fragmented by my own assumptions and the pieces I had never been allowed to see. The presence of someone neutral, someone outside the immediate web of tension, helped me see the cracks and gaps more clearly.
As we spoke, Claire suggested a practical step. Gather evidence, document claims, and, most importantly, get independent verification where possible. "Jenna," she said, "if you're serious about understanding your place in the family, you need more than stories and hints. You need proof. Otherwise, it's just rumor and perception. And with Harper involved, you're going to need something concrete." The suggestion of proof resonated deeply with me. In the past, I had always trusted the family narrative, never questioning it. But after Harper's sharp exclusion and Dad's cryptic explanations, I knew trust alone would not suffice. Evidence, whether documents, testimonies, or, even more decisively, DNA testing, was necessary to understand the truth of my identity and my rightful place in the family. We began by retracing family documents and old records. Claire and I dug through boxes of photographs, old birth certificates, letters, and even the family Bibles stored in the attic. Each item seemed to offer hints, contradictions, or confirmations, and together we began to map a timeline of events, relationships, and decisions that had long been obscured. We found letters from relatives who had expressed concern about lineage and inheritance, notes about past disputes over family property, and references to cousins and extended family members whose connections were strangely underexplored. Each discovery heightened the sense that the story Harper had tried to frame for Easter was only a fragment of a much larger narrative, a narrative carefully curated to control perception and influence behavior within the household. Harper, as expected, became aware of our efforts almost immediately. When she noticed Claire's presence and our methodical review of documents, she grew tense, pacing the living room and casting sharp glances in our direction. "What are you two doing?" she demanded at one point, her voice laced with authority and underlying frustration. I met her gaze firmly, refusing to be intimidated. "We're trying to understand the truth, Harper. You've made it clear that I've been excluded. Now I need to know why." She stopped abruptly, her hands tightening into fists at her sides, but she said nothing further, retreating instead to her room. Her silence, though unsettling,
spoke volumes. The first cracks in her composure and the family's carefully maintained facade were beginning to show. The process of gathering evidence became a turning point in itself. It shifted the dynamic from one of rumor, fear, and selective memory to a more objective, fact-based investigation. Claire helped me keep track of discrepancies, note potential leads, and identify areas requiring further verification. We began to discuss DNA testing as a final measure, understanding that this would provide the most undeniable proof of biological relationships and, ultimately, my place in the family. The conversation about DNA was delicate but necessary. It felt like stepping into uncharted territory, a space that promised clarity but also carried the potential for intense conflict and upheaval. By evening, we had assembled a comprehensive portfolio of evidence, ranging from old photographs and letters to notarized documents and family records. Each piece told part of the story, hinting at the fractures, omissions, and inconsistencies that had defined our family interactions for decades. Claire looked at me and said softly, "This is just the beginning. The real turning point will come when we get an outside confirmation. That's when the truth will be undeniable, and everyone will have to face it." I nodded, my pulse quickening at the thought. The stage was set. The outside eyes, Claire's perspective, her objective approach, and eventually the scientific proof of DNA would shine a light on the hidden truth. What had begun as a personal slight, a sibling's sharp words over Easter brunch, was evolving into a full-scale revelation that would challenge assumptions, expose secrets, and force the family to confront realities long denied. The following days were a delicate balancing act between careful investigation and navigating Harper's escalating opposition. From the moment Claire and I began examining family documents and tracing records, Harper became increasingly defensive, her previously controlled demeanor giving way to sharp remarks, cold glares, and subtle attempts to undermine our progress. Every question I asked, every file I reviewed, seemed to put her on edge, and I quickly realized that she perceived our pursuit of truth not as curiosity or justice, but as a threat to the carefully constructed narrative she had maintained for years. Even casual remarks from Dad or Mom, passing comments meant to soothe or redirect, were met with pointed interruptions, as though Harper was asserting authority over what could and could not be discussed. I began to understand that uncovering the hidden truth would not be a passive journey. It would involve confrontation, resistance, and moments where her defensiveness escalated to full-blown opposition. I decided to maintain a methodical approach, documenting every interaction, noting inconsistencies in Harper's statements, and cross-referencing them with the documents we had gathered. Claire became an invaluable partner, offering insight from a perspective unclouded by long-standing family bias. "She's bracing for a loss of control," Claire noted one afternoon, as Harper stormed past us, muttering about interfering outsiders. "Your sister thrives on controlling the narrative. Every fact, every memory, every interpretation has been carefully curated to protect her position. But once you bring in documented evidence, her power starts to slip. That's why she's reacting this way." Her words resonated deeply with me. I realized that Harper's exclusionary comments about Easter weren't merely about the holiday itself. They were a manifestation of her fear that the hidden truths, once revealed, would upend the authority she had assumed over family perception.
The tension escalated when Harper attempted to remove certain documents from our workspace, claiming that some things shouldn't be dug up. I confronted her, my voice steady despite the rising anger in my chest. "Harper, these aren't just pieces of paper. They're evidence of decisions, relationships, and histories that have shaped all of us. You can't stop this just because it challenges your comfort zone." Her reaction was a mixture of indignation and desperation. "You don't understand," she exclaimed. "Some truths aren't meant to be known. You'll only ruin everything if you keep pushing." I could see the conflict in her eyes, the defensiveness masking a flicker of fear, the first visible crack in the shield she had built around her perception of family control. I realized then that opposition from Harper would not be simply verbal. It would intensify as the investigation deepened, making the path to clarity increasingly fraught. Meanwhile, Mom and Dad, who had been mostly silent observers until this point, began to show signs of unease. They had attempted to maintain neutrality, hoping that tensions would subside naturally, but Harper's behavior and our insistence on evidence forced them to reckon with the truth themselves. There were quiet discussions late at night, hushed conversations in the kitchen, and moments where I overheard Dad muttering about things we should have addressed long ago. The family dynamic was shifting, the hidden undercurrents now surfacing with every document, photograph, and conversation. I recognized that the opposition wasn't solely Harper's. It was embedded in the family's collective reluctance to face reality, the fear that the truths we were uncovering would disrupt long-held assumptions and patterns. In response, I intensified my efforts to compile evidence systematically. We organized the documents chronologically, created a detailed family tree highlighting connections, and cross-referenced every note, letter, and photograph with first-hand accounts where possible. Claire suggested we begin discussing the potential for DNA verification, framing it not as a threat, but as a factual measure to clarify long-standing uncertainty. Once you have that confirmation, the opposition has no grounds left to manipulate perception, she explained. The idea of scientific proof brought a sense of anticipation and apprehension. It was the tool that could transform suspicion into undeniable fact. But it also represented a point where resistance would likely peak. Harper would be forced to confront objective reality, and I had to prepare for her reaction. As the days unfolded, the pressure mounted. Every attempt to gather evidence was met with passive-aggressive resistance, veiled threats, and emotional appeals designed to stall or divert attention. Harper's behavior fluctuated between calculated control and raw frustration, a pattern that revealed the depth of her investment in maintaining dominance over the family narrative. Even casual exchanges with relatives became arenas for subtle manipulation, with Harper subtly steering conversations, inserting misleading comments, and testing reactions. The rising opposition was no longer subtle. It was a constant, pervasive presence, challenging every move we made and heightening the stakes of our investigation. Through it all, I remained focused on the goal, uncovering the truth, asserting my place in the family, and confronting the patterns of secrecy that had persisted for decades. The tension, the opposition, and the resistance became a crucible, testing my patience, resolve, and ability to navigate conflict while remaining objective. I recognized that the gathering of evidence was not merely a logistical challenge. It was an emotional and psychological battlefield, one in which Harper's resistance, the family's history of secrecy, and my own fears would collide. Every document verified, every inconsistency noted, and every observation recorded brought me closer to clarity, but also closer to the inevitable confrontation where truth and denial would face off. By the end of the week, our investigation had laid bare significant gaps, inconsistencies, and previously hidden details, forcing a reckoning that Harper could no longer ignore. The rising opposition, while formidable, had also illuminated weaknesses in her control, revealing that the truth was no longer negotiable or easily suppressed. The first pinch point had been reached. The tension had escalated, resistance had intensified, and the stakes had never been higher. The stage was set for the moment when undeniable proof would emerge, pushing us toward a confrontation that would test loyalties, courage, and the very definition of family. The day the DNA results arrived, the house felt charged with a strange mix of anticipation, anxiety, and quiet dread. I had chosen to have the testing done through a neutral, professional laboratory, ensuring that the results would be objective and beyond dispute. Claire and I had spent the morning reviewing the evidence one last time, arranging the documents and photographs we had collected as a kind of prelude to the revelation that was about to unfold. Every paper, every note, every photograph we had painstakingly gathered over the past week now felt like a piece of a puzzle poised to reveal the full picture. I could feel Harper watching us from across the room, her posture stiff, her expression carefully neutral, though her fingers tapped incessantly against the edge of the counter. I knew she understood the significance of the moment, perhaps even more than I did.
When the email finally arrived from the laboratory, my heart pounded in my chest. Claire and I opened it together, our eyes scanning the results with a mixture of fear and hope. The data was clear, irrefutable, and precise. It spelled out the truth in a way that no one could argue with. The results confirmed biological relationships, clarified lineage, and validated the connections that had long been in question. As I read the findings, a rush of relief mixed with shock surged through me. The hidden truth, the one that Harper had so carefully tried to control, was now undeniable. My place in the family, which had been called into question, was scientifically confirmed. The documents and observations we had compiled were corroborated by this concrete proof, and suddenly, the carefully maintained web of secrecy began to unravel. Harper's reaction was immediate and intense. She stepped back, her eyes wide, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the counter for support. For a moment, there was silence, broken only by the faint hum of the refrigerator. Then her voice cut through the room, sharp but tinged with disbelief. This can't be right," she stammered. I met her gaze steadily, trying to remain calm even as my own emotions surged. "It's right, Harper. It's all here, and the lab results confirm it. The truth doesn't lie, and neither do the documents we've collected." Her composure faltered, and for the first time in our family history, I saw vulnerability there, a crack in the armor of certainty she had always displayed. The undeniable proof had shifted the balance, turning the tables and forcing a confrontation that had been building for weeks. Mom and Dad entered the room cautiously, drawn by the tension. When they saw the results on my laptop screen, their expressions were a mixture of relief, apprehension, and resignation. They had long been aware of the hidden truths and the family dynamics that had allowed secrecy and selective inclusion to dominate, but seeing the scientific confirmation brought those realities into immediate, undeniable focus. Dad exhaled heavily, his shoulders sagging as if a weight he had been carrying for decades was finally released. I think it's time we acknowledged what's always been true," he said, his voice low but firm. Mom nodded, her eyes glistening, finally willing to confront the truths that had remained unspoken for so long. The undeniable proof had created a moment of clarity that no one could avoid, compelling the family to face reality in a way that mere discussion or argument never could. As the day unfolded, the full implications of the revelation began to surface. Conversations that had been tense and guarded now shifted toward acknowledgement and reflection. Family members who had previously been passive observers started to engage more openly, asking questions, clarifying details, and offering memories that aligned with the confirmed facts. Harper's defensiveness gradually gave way to a complex mixture of guilt, embarrassment, and recognition of her own role in perpetuating secrecy and exclusion. For the first time, it was possible to discuss the hidden dynamics without fear of denial or dismissal, because the proof provided a foundation that was impossible to challenge. The undeniable evidence also sparked a deeper emotional reckoning. I realized that the relief I felt was intertwined with sadness for the years spent questioning my place in the family, for the subtle exclusions and emotional distance that had been maintained, and for the realization that family traditions like Easter had been complicated by hidden truths. At the same time, there was an exhilarating sense of empowerment. The proof had not only validated my identity and my belonging, but it had also transformed the dynamic of authority and perception within the family. For the first time, the narrative was mine as much as anyone else's, and the long-suppressed balance of power had begun to shift. Harper watched quietly, her presence steady and grounding. "This is the turning point," she said softly. "The undeniable proof changes everything. It's no longer about debate or speculation. It's about acknowledgement and choice. Now they have to face the reality, and you have the clarity to guide what happens next." Her words resonated deeply. I understood that the midpoint had arrived, the moment where the truth could no longer be denied, where the hidden dynamics were fully exposed, and where the family's response would define the path forward.
The undeniable proof was not just information, it was a catalyst for transformation, compelling honesty, reflection, and ultimately the possibility of reconciliation. By evening, the atmosphere in the house had shifted. The tension remained, but it was no longer purely defensive or adversarial. Instead, it was layered with recognition, acceptance, and cautious anticipation. Harper's earlier hostility was replaced by tentative engagement, and Mom and Dad were beginning to confront the realities they had long avoided. The undeniable proof had changed the landscape entirely. What had started as a personal slight over Easter brunch had now escalated into a full confrontation with the truth, reshaping relationships, redefining roles, and forcing a reckoning that would have lasting consequences for every member of the family. The midpoint was complete, and the story of hidden truths, selective exclusion, and family identity had reached a stage from which there was no turning back.
The moment the DNA results were revealed, the house fell into a charged, uneasy silence that seemed to stretch for hours. Harper stood frozen, her expression a mixture of shock, disbelief, and fury, while I felt a strange combination of relief and apprehension. It was one thing to have confirmation, undeniable proof, and yet another to confront the reality that this proof now demanded action, accountability, and, most importantly, truth-telling. I realized that the time for hesitation was over. The choice to speak, to confront the family's long-standing secrets, and to assert my rightful place in a family had arrived. There was no going back to pretending ignorance, no returning to the old rhythms of exclusion and manipulation. The path forward was clear, and it was mine to take. But I knew it would be neither easy nor devoid of emotional cost. I decided to call a family meeting that evening, inviting Mom, Dad, Harper, and even Claire to participate as a neutral observer and moderator. I felt the weight of responsibility pressing on me, knowing that this confrontation would challenge not only Harper's long-held authority, but also the deeply ingrained patterns of secrecy that had governed our interactions for decades. The living room, once a space of comfort and casual family activity, now felt more like a courtroom. Chairs were arranged in a semicircle, the documents we had collected carefully stacked on the coffee table, and the DNA report displayed on my laptop. As I looked at each family member, I could see the tension etched into their faces, the anticipation, the fear of judgment, and perhaps the dawning recognition that the carefully curated family narrative was about to be dismantled. I began the meeting cautiously, my voice calm but deliberate. I've gathered information, documents, photographs, and now we have scientific confirmation about our family relationships, I said, gesturing to the laptop screen where the DNA results were displayed. For years, there have been patterns, exclusions, and unspoken rules that have shaped how we interact and who is included in family traditions. Today, we have the opportunity to acknowledge the truth and confront it honestly. Harper shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting between me and the laptop, but she did not interrupt. Mom and Dad exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of resignation and cautious hope. I realized that by presenting the evidence in a structured, calm manner, I was establishing the framework for accountability and forcing the family to confront the facts without room for denial. As the meeting progressed, I walked them through the evidence methodically, the letters, the photographs, the historical records, and finally the DNA report. Each piece reinforced the others, building an irrefutable case that validated my identity and highlighted the inconsistencies in the family narrative that had long favored Harper's version of events. I could feel the tension rising with every detail, a tangible energy crackling in the room as the truth became impossible to ignore. Harper's initial shock slowly shifted into frustration, then into defensive deflection. "This doesn't change everything," she protested, her voice tight with emotion. "There are still decisions, traditions, and responsibilities that have to be considered. You think one test erases decades of experience?" I met her gaze steadily, refusing to be drawn into an argument. "No, Harper," I said firmly. It doesn't erase anything, but it does force us to confront what's real, what has been hidden, and what has been selectively controlled. For years, I've been treated as if I don't belong in this family, as if certain privileges and truths were reserved for you alone. That ends now. The room was quiet for a moment, the gravity of my words settling over everyone present. I could see the tension in Mom and Dad, their hesitation, and the faint flicker of understanding beginning to form. Claire, sitting quietly, gave me a subtle nod, encouraging me to continue with composure and resolution. Then came the emotional climax, the moment where resistance would either solidify or crumble. I addressed the larger family patterns, not just Harper's actions, but the way that the entire household had allowed secrecy, favoritism, and selective truths to dominate interactions for decades. This is bigger than any of us individually. It's about acknowledging the systems we've inherited, the biases we've perpetuated, and the choices we make moving forward. Today, we have the undeniable proof that we cannot ignore. It's time to stop hiding behind old stories and start facing the truth openly. Harper's hands tightened into fists at her sides, and I could see the internal struggle in her expression. For the first time, I sensed that her rigid control over the narrative was being tested, and that the undeniable proof had stripped away the armor she had long used to assert authority. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mom spoke. Her voice trembled, but carried strength. We need to acknowledge this, all of us. We've hidden, we've protected, and sometimes we've ignored. But this is the truth, and it cannot be denied. Dad nodded, adding his own acknowledgement of the past patterns and the necessity for honesty. Harper, however, remained silent, her anger giving way to a mixture of guilt and uncertainty. The choice to speak, to stop protecting old secrets, had created a turning point. Old loyalties were tested, alliances reevaluated, and the foundation of our family dynamic shifted irrevocably.
By the end of the evening, the atmosphere had changed dramatically. The confrontation had forced a reckoning. Harper had no choice but to confront the facts. Mom and Dad had acknowledged the patterns of secrecy, and I had claimed my space as a fully recognized member of the family. The all-is-lost moment had arrived not in defeat, but in the stark necessity of truth-telling, in the confrontation that exposed the entire family to realities long ignored. The decision to speak, once daunting, had become a catalyst for transformation, marking a definitive point where the old ways could no longer dictate our interactions, and the hidden truths could finally begin to guide future choices. The days following the family meeting were tense, charged with an energy that made even the simplest interactions feel like high-stakes negotiations. Harper, who had previously relied on control and selective storytelling to maintain dominance, was now visibly unsettled. Every word, every glance, and every casual conversation seemed to carry weight she hadn't anticipated. It was as if the undeniable proof we had uncovered had dismantled her authority, and she was now forced to navigate a reality where her power was no longer absolute. The mounting pressure was not just emotional, it was strategic. Harper became increasingly unpredictable, alternating between attempts at reconciliation, veiled threats, and moments of outright hostility, creating a climate where every interaction required careful consideration and measured responses. I quickly realized that this second pinch point was going to test more than patience. It was going to test endurance, diplomacy, and emotional resilience. Claire remained by my side, her calm and analytical perspective invaluable as we monitored Harper's behavior and prepared for escalating confrontations. She suggested keeping detailed notes, documenting interactions, and maintaining a record of any intimidation or manipulation attempts. Once the pressure mounts further, you'll want to have evidence of the patterns, not just the results, she advised. Her foresight proved essential as it became immediately clear that Harper was intent on reclaiming narrative control, attempting to frame any questioning or investigation as overstepping, intrusion, or even betrayal.
At first, Harper's tactics were subtle. She would insert misleading comments into conversations, challenge interpretations of documents we had collected, and question the legitimacy of our sources. I responded with patience, using facts and evidence to counter her assertions, refusing to allow deflection or manipulation to derail the pursuit of truth. Each encounter, while frustrating, reinforced the necessity of remaining calm and objective. It became clear that the mounting pressure was as much psychological as it was relational. The more Harper felt her authority slipping, the more she sought to destabilize my position, challenge my credibility, and assert dominance through intimidation. Mom and Dad, now more engaged than ever, attempted to mediate, though even they struggled to balance loyalty, emotional ties, and the undeniable evidence before them. They encouraged dialogue, yet their cautiousness often meant that Harper's attempts to shift blame or rewrite narratives found temporary purchase. I realized that confrontation with Harper required not just clarity and evidence, but also careful management of family dynamics, empathy for their fears, and unwavering commitment to truth. Every conversation became a delicate negotiation where emotional stakes and relational history intersected with the raw facts we had uncovered. The escalation became apparent during a dinner conversation, a moment that had always been routine, but now carried a weight I had never experienced. Harper, sensing an opportunity, launched into a critique of my approach, her voice steady but edged with hostility. "You think just because you have a report from a lab, you understand everything," she said, gesturing toward the printed DNA results on the counter. "There's more to family than tests and documents. You're missing the bigger picture." I remained composed, responding deliberately. "Harper, the bigger picture includes honesty, inclusion, and acknowledgement of what has always been true. The evidence doesn't erase relationships, but it does illuminate truths you've tried to control. That's not missing the bigger picture. It's finally seeing it." Her eyes flashed with frustration, but she fell silent, the tension between us thickening like an invisible wall. The mounting pressure extended beyond personal interactions. Family friends and extended relatives began to sense the shift in dynamics, offering opinions, advice, and sometimes judgment, each adding a layer of external scrutiny that amplified the internal tension. Invitations, casual visits, and social gatherings became subtle arenas where loyalty and perception were tested. Harper's discomfort became more pronounced, her earlier confidence replaced with a cautious watchfulness and occasional outbursts that reflected both fear and resistance. It became clear that the path to resolution would require navigating not just direct confrontation, but also the ripple effects of truth exposure across extended family networks. Meanwhile, I continued to strengthen my own position, balancing emotional intelligence with evidence-based clarity. I kept dialogue open with Mom and Dad, seeking guidance while asserting the necessity of acknowledgement and honesty. Claire remained my anchor, helping me anticipate Harper's responses and develop strategies to manage escalating tensions without resorting to aggression or retaliation. It was during these days that I fully understood the complexity of confronting a family antagonist, not merely as a sibling conflict, but as a multi-layered psychological and relational challenge where truth, perception, and emotional control collided.
By the end of the week, the pressure had reached a peak. Harper's attempts at intimidation were more frequent, but so was her acknowledgement of facts she could no longer deny. The family dynamic had shifted irrevocably. The old structures of control, secrecy, and selective inclusion were visibly crumbling under the weight of evidence and unflinching pursuit of truth. The second pinch point had accomplished its purpose. It exposed the full extent of opposition, tested resilience and strategy, and forced everyone involved to confront not only the facts, but also the consequences of long-maintained deception. It was a crucible, and every member of the family, whether resistant, neutral, or supportive, had been forced to reckon with the realities that had been simmering beneath the surface for decades. By the time night fell, I felt a sense of exhaustion.
tempered by the knowledge that the mounting pressure was leading to a final confrontation that could no longer be avoided. Harper's mask had dropped in moments of vulnerability and anger, revealing both fear and awareness of the undeniable truth. The stage was set for the dark night of the soul, the point where emotional stakes, relational tension, and consequences would collide, leaving clarity, courage, and resilience as the only guiding forces through the next stage of revelation. The truth had been uncovered, the opposition had been revealed, and now the most challenging emotional and moral trial was approaching. The days following the mounting tension felt like walking through a storm with no shelter in sight. The house, which had always been a place of familiarity and comfort, now felt alien, heavy with unspoken accusations and the echoes of truths long denied. Harper's hostility had intensified, shifting from veiled manipulation to direct confrontations that left the air around me thick with anxiety. Even small interactions like passing in the hallway or casual remarks at meals carried the weight of judgment, scorn, or subtle intimidation. I could feel the isolation creeping in, not because anyone had openly shunned me, but because the truth had changed the rules of engagement, and now everyone, including my parents, was navigating a new landscape of tension, guilt, and uncertainty. For the first time, I realized that revealing the truth carried consequences far beyond what I had anticipated, and that the emotional toll would be far more profound than I had imagined. Harper's reactions were relentless. She questioned motives, accused me of exaggerating past slights, and repeatedly invoked the family's desire for harmony, implying that pursuing honesty was a disruption, a betrayal. "You're tearing this family apart," she snapped during one particularly heated argument, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "All this evidence, all this proof, you think it matters more than love? You're destroying everything." I understood, even in the intensity of the moment, that her words were a projection of the inner turmoil that had been building ever since the DNA results confirmed what she had long tried to deny. The confrontation was no longer about the validity of facts. It was about control, pride, and the emotional consequences of facing a truth that could no longer be denied. Mom and Dad tried to mediate, but even their interventions felt fragile. Their attempts to balance the acknowledgement of evidence with the desire to maintain peace seemed almost futile against the emotional storm Harper had unleashed. I found myself navigating a tightrope, trying to assert the undeniable truths we had uncovered, while also managing the delicate emotions of a family in turmoil. Each interaction left me drained, the weight of responsibility pressing heavily on my shoulders. I was acutely aware that the decisions I made, the way I presented information, and the calmness I maintained could either exacerbate or alleviate the emotional fallout. The personal cost of truth-telling became painfully clear. Isolation, conflict, and the risk of deepening familial divides were all now part of the process. Late one evening, after another intense confrontation that left Harper slamming doors and Mom quietly sobbing in the kitchen, I retreated to my room to process the events. The magnitude of what had occurred began to settle in. The undeniable proof, the confrontation, and the mounting opposition had culminated in a moment where I felt the full weight of consequences pressing down. Fear, doubt, and exhaustion mingled with relief and validation. I questioned whether I had done the right thing, whether the pursuit of truth was worth the emotional upheaval it had unleashed. The isolation felt real. Even with clear support, I understood that some battles had to be faced in solitude, that courage was not the absence of fear, but the act of moving forward despite it. The following day brought the first tangible consequences. Extended family members, who had previously been neutral or uninvolved, began reaching out with questions, observations, and, in some cases, veiled criticism. Some expressed shock, others concern, and a few even aligned with Harper, claiming that the disruption of long-standing family dynamics was unnecessary or unwise. Each interaction tested my patience and resolve.
I realized that speaking truth in a family context was not a linear process. The backlash was complex, emotional, and often unpredictable. Some moments offered support and understanding, while others delivered doubt and criticism. The emotional roller coaster of navigating validation and backlash was exhausting, yet it was a necessary crucible in which both personal and familial truths were forged.
Harper's resistance reached its peak during a particularly volatile family dinner. She confronted me openly, challenging both the evidence and my motives, her voice sharp with desperation and anger. "You think you know everything. You've turned our family upside down," she shouted, slamming her hand against the table. I remained calm, allowing the evidence and the facts to speak for themselves. "I don't think I know everything," I replied evenly. "But what I do know is that the truth cannot be hidden any longer. This isn't about control or punishment. It's about honesty, recognition, and finally acknowledging what has always been real." Her glare pierced me, but I held my ground, understanding that this confrontation, however painful, was the necessary darkness before resolution could emerge. By the evening's end, the house felt heavy with fatigue and tension. The dark night of the soul had arrived, the lowest point where emotional, relational, and personal stakes collided. I felt the full consequences of speaking the truth: isolation, confrontation, emotional strain, and the sobering awareness that clarity and justice often carry costs. Yet amidst the exhaustion, a quiet sense of clarity began to form. The undeniable evidence and the confrontations that followed had laid bare the patterns of secrecy, exclusion, and selective narrative control. While the fallout was intense, it had also created a space for honesty, reflection, and eventual reconciliation. The path forward was uncertain, but the truth had finally been spoken, and there was no turning back. In that low, heavy moment, I realized that courage was not about avoiding conflict or emotional turmoil, but about moving forward in spite of it. The revelations had exposed the family's deepest vulnerabilities, including my own, and the journey through confrontation, resistance, and backlash had become a crucible in which not just facts, but relationships, loyalties, and personal strength were tested and refined. It was the point where the darkness before resolution was at its peak, the emotional nadir from which every subsequent step would lead toward confrontation, acknowledgement, and eventual vindication. The day of the formal confrontation arrived, and the house had transformed from a place of private tension to a stage for accountability. I had prepared meticulously, organizing every document, photograph, and note to present a coherent, undisputable case. Claire sat beside me, her presence calm and reassuring, while Mom and Dad occupied chairs nearby, bracing themselves for the inevitable escalation. Harper, sensing the magnitude of the moment, had assumed her usual posture of controlled authority, though beneath the surface, her eyes betrayed anxiety, unease, and anticipation. The atmosphere was thick with expectation. Every family member present understood that this was the day the hidden truths would no longer be negotiable, the day the evidence would demand acknowledgement and action. I began deliberately, outlining the history that had led us to this confrontation. I presented the sequence of documents, photographs, and first-hand accounts, emphasizing patterns of exclusion, selective memory, and the careful construction of narratives that had favored Harper's perspective for years. "This isn't about blame," I explained, my voice steady, "but about recognition, clarity, and finally acknowledging what has always been true. The documents and the DNA report confirm facts that cannot be ignored, and it's time for these truths to be recognized openly." Harper's eyes narrowed, her lips pressing into a thin line, but she said nothing, as if trying to absorb the full weight of the presentation without reacting impulsively. The undeniable proof, laid out methodically and with careful precision, was impossible to contest. Each piece reinforced the other. The records aligned with the photographs, the personal accounts corroborated the documents, and the DNA report confirmed every familial connection. Claire occasionally whispered clarifying points, helping to maintain focus and ensuring that the evidence was presented in a clear, logical sequence. The process was deliberate, almost clinical, yet it carried a profound emotional weight. Every piece of proof highlighted years of exclusion, misrepresentation, and selective truth-telling, and every revelation was a step closer to holding Harper accountable while validating my place in the family. As the presentation continued, the tension reached a palpable peak. Harper attempted to interject, her voice tight with frustration and disbelief. "You're twisting everything," she exclaimed, gesturing toward the documents. "These facts don't reflect the full story. You're making it seem worse than it is." I paused, meeting her gaze steadily. "Harper, the facts aren't twisted. They are what they are. This isn't about exaggeration or vilification. It's about recognition. The evidence confirms realities that have been hidden, and for the first time, we are confronting them openly." The firmness of my tone, backed by the weight of documentation, left little room for deflection. For the first time, it was clear that the balance of power had shifted. Harper could no longer rely on control or manipulation to dominate the narrative. Mom and Dad, previously cautious, began to weigh in, reinforcing the presentation with their own observations and acknowledgments. "We've avoided confronting these realities for too long," Dad admitted, his voice steady. "But seeing it all together now, it's clear that the truth cannot be ignored." Mom nodded, adding, "We need to acknowledge what has been hidden and make space for honesty moving forward. It's painful, but necessary." Harper's composure faltered slightly, the cracks in her defensive armor now visible to everyone present. The undeniable proof, combined with the moral authority of Mom and Dad, created a moment in which denial and resistance could no longer dominate the room.
The confrontation reached its apex when I presented the final pieces of evidence, the direct lineage confirmations and supporting records that left no ambiguity regarding my place in the family. The room was silent, every person present processing the implications of the revelations. Harper's voice, once sharp and domineering, fell into a tremor of reluctant acknowledgement. I didn't expect this," she admitted, her eyes briefly meeting mine. I thought I knew everything. But this changes things." It was a moment of raw vulnerability, the culmination of tension, opposition, and undeniable proof converging into a single point of reckoning. The confrontation, long feared and anticipated, had reached its climax, and the truth now stood unchallenged in the center of the room. As the hours unfolded, the confrontation evolved from tension-filled confrontation to measured dialogue. Harper, still processing, began asking questions, seeking clarification, and tentatively engaging with the evidence rather than resisting it outright. Mom and Dad facilitated the discussion, ensuring that the focus remained on recognition, understanding, and the implications of past actions. I realized that the final push, the presentation of undeniable truth, was not merely about asserting facts, but about creating an environment in which acknowledgement, reconciliation, and accountability could occur. The climax had been reached. Truth was on trial, and the evidence had spoken with clarity, leaving no room for misinterpretation or avoidance. By the evening's end, a cautious calm had settled over the household. Harper, while still grappling with the emotional impact, had ceased active opposition, and the family was beginning to navigate a path toward acknowledgement and repair. The presentation, the confrontation, and the clarity of undeniable evidence had validated my courage, affirmed my identity, and reshaped the dynamics of authority, perception, and inclusion within the family. The truth, once hidden and resisted, was now fully recognized, and the foundation for justice, vindication, and eventual reconciliation had been firmly established.
In the days following the confrontation, a sense of cautious clarity began to settle over the household. The tension that had dominated every corner of our lives gradually gave way to conversations marked by acknowledgement, reflection, and tentative reconciliation. Harper, though still struggling with embarrassment and lingering defensiveness, had begun to engage with the truth rather than fight it outright. The DNA results and supporting documentation had left no room for denial, and slowly she began to recognize the patterns of exclusion and control that had shaped our interactions for so long. It was not a smooth or immediate process, but the foundation for change had been laid, and for the first time, the family could begin to address the consequences of long-held secrecy. Mom and Dad took active roles in fostering dialogue and healing. They facilitated discussions that encouraged honesty, reflection, and accountability, helping each family member articulate feelings, clarify misunderstandings, and begin the work of repairing relationships. Their acknowledgement of past oversights and failures was a critical component of this process, signaling a shift from avoidance to responsibility. "We've allowed patterns to continue for too long," Mom said one evening, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's time to confront them honestly, acknowledge our mistakes, and commit to a future built on truth and respect." Dad echoed her sentiment, reinforcing the idea that reconciliation required both recognition of past harm and a commitment to future integrity. Harper's journey toward acceptance was slow and uneven. There were moments of resistance, subtle attempts to minimize the impact of her actions, and occasional lapses into old defensive patterns. Yet the undeniable proof had fundamentally altered the landscape. Her previous authority had been dismantled, her claims could no longer dominate, and she was now compelled to reckon with the consequences of her choices. Over time, these confrontations gave way to tentative engagement as Harper began asking questions, seeking to understand the full scope of the evidence, and attempting cautiously to repair fractured relationships. The process was painstaking, but the trajectory was clear. The truth had prevailed over denial, and the opportunity for accountability and growth was now within reach. I focused on rebuilding connections with family members, emphasizing transparency, patience, and empathy. Each conversation was approached deliberately, with the understanding that healing required both acknowledgement and trust. I shared memories, clarified misunderstandings, and worked to establish a new baseline for interactions, one rooted in honesty and mutual respect rather than control and secrecy. Claire continued to support me through this process, offering perspective, encouragement, and guidance on how to navigate delicate family dynamics without escalating conflict. Together, we reinforced the principle that truth, once revealed, must be honored not just in documentation, but in behavior, relationships, and ongoing choices. One of the most significant changes during this period was the family's approach to traditions, particularly those that had been sources of tension and exclusion. Easter, the holiday that had ignited so much conflict, became a focal point for demonstrating commitment to inclusion and acknowledgement. The family consciously made decisions to honor everyone's place, recognizing that previous exclusions had been based on misunderstandings, selective narratives, and unchallenged assumptions. Harper, though initially reluctant, participated in planning and welcomed input from all family members, signaling a shift in her willingness to share authority and acknowledge the legitimacy of others' perspectives. The transformation was gradual but tangible, and it symbolized a broader shift in the family's culture toward openness, fairness, and mutual recognition.
Beyond the immediate family, the ramifications of the confrontation and acknowledgement extended into our wider social circles. Extended family members, friends, and acquaintances observed the change in dynamics, offering support, validation, and sometimes advice. The ripple effects reinforced the importance of honesty and accountability, demonstrating that confronting hidden truths could lead not only to personal validation, but also to broader relational improvements. I felt a growing sense of empowerment, understanding that the courage to speak and act had not only altered my own life, but also influenced the behaviors, attitudes, and expectations of those around me.
Over the course of several weeks, the household began to stabilize. Conversations that had previously been charged with tension and defensiveness became more measured, constructive, and forward-looking. The acknowledgement of past patterns and mistakes created a foundation for proactive communication, shared decision-making, and mutual respect. Harper, Mom, and Dad began to establish new boundaries, expectations, and methods for addressing disagreements, relying on transparency and evidence rather than assumption, authority, or exclusion. Even the smallest interactions, shared meals, casual conversations, and collaborative planning reflected the impact of truth, recognition, and accountability. By the end of this period, I felt a sense of relief tempered by awareness. The family had reached a new equilibrium, one in which honesty, acknowledgement, and accountability formed the foundation for relationships and traditions. The emotional turbulence of the confrontation and backlash had passed, leaving in its wake a renewed commitment to fairness, inclusion, and mutual respect. The process of reconciliation was ongoing, but the direction was clear. The family had recognized the consequences of hidden truths, validated my identity and place, and committed to a future built on integrity and transparency. The resolution was not merely about vindication, it was about transformation. It marked the point at which the long struggle for acknowledgement and fairness began to yield tangible results. Relationships were being repaired, authority was being balanced, and traditions that had once been sources of conflict were being redefined to honor every member's role. The journey through confrontation, opposition, and emotional intensity had culminated in a shared understanding. Truth had prevailed, consequences had been acknowledged, and the family was now poised to move forward with a newfound clarity, cohesion, and sense of purpose. Months had passed since the revelation, and the household had begun to settle into a rhythm marked by honesty, respect, and inclusion. The confrontation, the undeniable evidence, and the emotional upheaval had reshaped the very fabric of our family dynamics. Harper, once rigid in her attempts to control narratives and enforce exclusivity, had begun to integrate lessons from the confrontation into her behavior, though the process was gradual and required constant reflection. She had started participating in open dialogue, listening more than dictating, and acknowledging both past mistakes and present responsibilities. It was remarkable to witness this evolution, understanding that the force of truth, once fully revealed, had the power to not only confront, but also to transform. Our family traditions, particularly Easter, had been redefined to embrace inclusivity and recognition of every member's legitimate place. For the first time, I participated in planning and execution, working alongside Harper, Mom, and Dad to ensure that celebrations reflected unity rather than hierarchy. Every detail, from the seating arrangements to the preparation of meals, carried symbolic significance. It wasn't just about Easter. It was about acknowledging the long-overlooked contributions and rightful inclusion of everyone in family life. There was a quiet joy in seeing old patterns dissolve, replaced by collaboration, respect, and shared ownership of traditions. Even Harper, who had initially resisted change, displayed a newfound humility and willingness to honor others' perspectives, signaling that transformation had begun to take root. On a personal level, the journey had profoundly reshaped my own sense of self and purpose. The confrontation, the opposition, and the eventual acknowledgement had forced me to confront my fears, assert my voice, and claim my rightful place within the family. I discovered an inner strength I had not fully recognized before, an ability to navigate emotional storms, maintain clarity amidst conflict, and act with courage even when the stakes were high. This transformation extended beyond the family setting. I approached friendships, professional interactions, and personal relationships with a heightened sense of confidence, resilience, and commitment to integrity. The lessons learned in the crucible of familial confrontation became guiding principles in all aspects of my life. Mom and Dad's support remained a crucial element of this ongoing transformation. Their willingness to acknowledge past mistakes, engage openly with difficult truths, and facilitate reconciliation had created a safe environment for growth and repair.
They encouraged continued dialogue, reflection, and accountability, demonstrating that acknowledgement of past failures did not diminish love, but strengthened the foundation for future relationships. Their active participation in reshaping family norms and addressing lingering tensions served as both a model and a catalyst for broader changes, reinforcing the idea that transformation requires deliberate action and sustained commitment. Claire, who had been a steady presence throughout the entire process, reflected on the changes we had witnessed. Her perspective helped me frame the confrontation and its aftermath not as a single victory, but as the beginning of a broader journey toward integrity and cohesion. "What you've achieved isn't just about recognition or vindication," she observed one afternoon as we reviewed family plans for the upcoming holiday. "It's about creating a blueprint for how families can navigate conflict, embrace truth, and emerge stronger. That's the lasting impact of what you've done." Her words resonated deeply, underscoring the broader significance of the transformation that had occurred, not only in my immediate family, but in how truth, courage, and accountability could ripple outward to influence others.
Even Harper, who had been the primary source of opposition, showed signs of authentic change. She began acknowledging her own role in exclusionary patterns, expressed remorse for past actions, and actively sought to make amends. While some scars remained, emotional memories of conflict and moments of resistance, the overall trajectory was toward restoration and fairness. Conversations became more collaborative, decision-making more inclusive, and the household atmosphere gradually shifted from tension to trust. The power of evidence, courage, and open acknowledgement had broken down old hierarchies, replaced by relationships founded on honesty, respect, and shared responsibility. The symbolic moments were small but powerful. Sitting together at a holiday meal with laughter, shared stories, and mutual appreciation filling the room, I recognized that the transformation was tangible. The DNA report and documentation that had once been a source of confrontation had become a symbol of empowerment, a reminder that truth once revealed cannot be ignored and can serve as a catalyst for healing. The family, once fractured by secrecy and selective narratives, had begun to function as a cohesive unit, capable of navigating disagreements with integrity and acknowledging each member's rightful place. Looking back, the journey from confrontation to transformation revealed the profound power of courage, evidence, and deliberate action. Speaking the truth had demanded emotional resilience, strategic thinking, and unwavering commitment. Yet the rewards were measurable: restored relationships, newfound respect, and the creation of a family culture rooted in transparency and fairness. The process validated not only my identity and contributions, but also the principle that hidden truths, once acknowledged, can guide families toward equity, understanding, and long-term cohesion. In the quiet of that transformed household, I finally felt peace. The confrontation, the mounting opposition, and the emotional upheaval had given way to empowerment, clarity, and purpose. Traditions were no longer a source of division. Every member's voice was honored, and the lessons of courage and honesty had become a living guide. The transformation was complete, from isolation to recognition, from conflict to inclusion, and from silence to empowered voice. I had claimed my space, upheld the truth, and witnessed the ripple effects of courage manifest in relationships, traditions, and shared understanding. The family was not perfect, but it was honest, accountable, and renewed. Proof that the power of truth, when embraced fully, could lead to genuine transformation and lasting purpose.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.